So the big news breaking in motorsport today is that Fernando Alonso will not be on the F1 grid in 2019. Joining me to discuss this shock announcement is Autosport Grand Prix editor Ed Straw and Grand Prix correspondent Scott Mitchell. Guys, reactions to that news?
Well, he said it's a shock announcement, but it's kind of 50% shock because it's Fernando Alonso. It's a two-time world champion, a legend of the sport, who will not be on the F1 grid next year. But it's also not a shock because it's been coming. He took the decision a while ago. Clearly, he doesn't want to spend next season scrapping around for 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th places like he's been doing. So I guess it takes a while to kind of come to terms with the fact that Alonso will not be on the grid.
I think the other thing as well is that Alonso has been sort of hinting at his dissatisfaction with F1 as a whole for quite a while. Obviously, we know it's easy to do that when you're at a team that is scrapping at the back and barely getting into the points, but he's been annoyed that even in a season where you have Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull winning at times, it's a dominant Grand Prix weekend. So if you turn up on a Friday and Mercedes is quickest, generally they're quickest the whole way through. There's no variety. Alonso's frustrated by that, and I think his sort of experience doing the Indianapolis 500 last year, obviously he's made his WEC debut now and he's won Le Mans, he's experienced these other categories where not only can he win but he can fight. It sort of appeals to him as a racer. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think his frustration is more, it's beyond just his own personal situation, and that has obviously come to a head to the point now where he just thinks he needs a fresh start somewhere else.
What does it say about the current state of Formula One that there isn't a team out there that he could go to?
Well, it says something about the current state of Formula One in that the top 3 teams are pretty much locked. So there's 3 teams he could move to that would give him a shot realistically next year of winning. You could argue maybe Renault, which is on the up, but next year I think, as Daniel Ricciardo will find out, it's probably a little bit early. But I think it also says something about Fernando Alonso. We saw Christian Horner making some comments, the Red Bull team principal, about the reasons they wouldn't look at Alonso as an option. So it's a bit of 50-50. The simple fact is drivers complain about the domination of 1, 2, 3 teams when they're outside of one of those 1, 2, 3 teams. If Alonso was in a Mercedes and had won the last few World Championships, he wouldn't be complaining and he'd be on the grid next year.
So the obvious question is, what's he do next? What's he going to be doing in 2019?
Well, I think the assumption everyone makes is that he is going to go to IndyCar. As we said, he's won Le Mans now. He's obviously got his Monaco Grand Prix wins. All he needs is the Indy 500 and he's won that Triple Crown. He views that Triple Crown as his way of showing he's the best driver. He can't do it in F1 because, as we've talked about, the way F1 is, the way the die is cast, you can't make a difference as a driver. He needs something else to show how good he is. The Triple Crown is one way to get that. We know McLaren's been linked with an IndyCar opportunity, so that's what I think everyone assumes and expects Alonso to be.
Well, it makes sense, like Scott said. When Alonso went to the Indy 500 last year and he was competitive there, he could have won that race. He had a Honda engine failure. He was in the mix, although it would be overstating it to say he was a dead cert to win it because it had a long battle ahead. But when he went to do that race, he said, well, you can prove you're the best by winning 7 World Championships like Michael Schumacher. That's not going to happen now, so the Triple Crown is now a big thing. And the good thing is that McLaren is looking seriously at a full-time IndyCar presence, not just for the 500, but for the whole season. And given that he's got this close relationship with McLaren, given that he said in the statement that McLaren put out to say he wouldn't be racing next year, that the door is still open to a return to McLaren in Formula One. If they get their house in order, they return to the front, then it could be the time for him to come back to the series. It was words like that. If he can stay in the McLaren fold, they can pay him and pay for him to do IndyCar in association with another team, most likely, just as the 500 was, then it's perfect, isn't it? He can go and race and win an IndyCar. Maybe he can see out the WEC Super season, which he should do with Toyota, and win the championship, which would add to the Le Mans title. So, it's perfect for Alonso, isn't it?
It'd be also a massive coup for IndyCar.
Yeah, I think last year when he went there to make his 500 debut, Autosport.com editor Glenn Freeman said that this is modern IndyCar's Mansell moment. This is the equivalent. He's shunning F1, turning his back, and it proves that IndyCar is more than just the Indy 500. I know that's what makes it the sort of the global appeal of the championship, is that one showpiece race that everybody knows and everybody wants to watch, and everybody outside of motorsport has heard of as well. But IndyCar as an actual championship obviously has some appeal if someone like Fernando Alonso wants to go and do it.
Now, the statement, as you pointed out a second ago, leaves the door open for him to return in 2020. What do we think the likelihood of that is?
I think if McLaren improves a lot next year, then maybe he will. Alonso will come back if he thinks he can fight for wins in a World Championship. That's what he'll want to do. That's why he's left the door open. So it really depends on what they're doing. Realistically speaking, I'd say McLaren's first real window for delivering certainly a car that could conceivably fight for the championship would be 2021, where we've got major new rule changes. He's still young enough then to come and do it. So I think he'll just keep doors open. And of course, anytime there's a big team vacancy, he'll be on the phone to check, because you never know what might happen. Someone could move on, another shock retirement, and suddenly, if you haven't got enough top drivers, then Fernando Alonso, if he's still active, he'll be an option.
It feels to me a little bit like when Jenson Button didn't retire from McLaren and F1, but he did retire. I mean, I know he came back last year, raced in Monaco when Alonso was at the Indy 500, but when Button walked away, he was treating it like it was his final race, and he went through all the motions of someone who's retiring from Grand Prix racing, but he never explicitly said he was retiring. He said that he wanted to have that option of coming back after a year. We know that now that isn't happening with Button. I feel like it's more of an option for Alonso to come back, because he's just that kind of guy. Like, you could feel like this is someone who's ending with 2 world titles. He should be happy with that, but this is Alonso. He's someone who it almost feels like a travesty that he's only got 2 world titles. He'll have that feeling of just feeling there's something left, some unfinished business, something that he needs to prove either to himself or to everybody else. And as Ed said, if there is that chance to get back in a top team, whether it's McLaren or someone else, I'm sure he'll snap it up.
Yeah, he's going to be a looming spectre in any contract negotiations when a drive comes up over that next time. Do you think, though, you could take 2 years away from Formula One if he was to delay the return till 2021 and still be competitive? Because, okay, you'd be racing in IndyCar, but that's not that same level of race sharpness that you would normally get.
I think if you're Alonso, and I think if you're a fully motivated Alonso, yes, he will stay race sharp with whatever else he's doing. Well, we're assuming he'll be in IndyCar. Whatever happens, I'm sure he'll be racing somewhere. So I think it's perfectly feasible for him to do that. But, age catches up with everyone, so he can't sit on the shelf forever. But there's no reason why a driver in that scenario can't do that. Obviously, the example everyone uses is Michael Schumacher, but he was out of certainly car racing competition. He dabbled in bikes for several years before he came back with Mercedes in 2010. So that's not quite the same comparison. And I think maybe Kimi Räikkönen's a good example. Remember, his comeback with the Lotus team after a couple of years in WRC went pretty well. And I think that's when you have a driver who is sharp and competitive and doing another category, they can slot in, provided they're willing to put the work in.
Yeah, it's the very best drivers are the guys that are capable of doing that. Alonso's up there with the best of them. So should that opportunity arise, what a comeback that would be. And another way for him to show how good he is by spending some time away, coming back and doing the business.
Let's say he doesn't come back and this is it for Fernando Alonso as a Formula One driver. Scott, you mentioned a double world champion, but surely, this is a guy who ought to achieve so much more.
Absolutely. He leaves an enormous hole behind, and F1 and McLaren can fill that to a point. They can get other drivers with big reputations, other drivers who are exciting on track, other drivers who like to complain over the radio and give everyone a bit of a laugh sometimes. But what they can't replace immediately is that massive box office brand value. And that's what Alonso has. And for someone who hasn't won a world title in 12 years, someone who hasn't won a race since 2013, for him to carry so much significance for the impact that this news has had, that shows just how valuable he is. Just shows that his value is much higher than the raw numbers, and the raw numbers alone are impressive. I think something like 32 race wins. He's going to end the season with the second highest starts count of any Grand Prix driver. So this is a guy who's going to go down as an F1 legend, whether he comes back after the end of the season or not.
But I think actually the numbers don't do him justice. We called him in the cover of an Autosport magazine last year a wasted talent, and that sounds incredibly harsh. He's a double world champion, 32 wins. He is an all-time great. But this was a driver who, when Schumacher retired, we were saying, could he win 7 world championships? He's had to watch Vettel and Hamilton rack up the wins and titles, and he will not have a CV that does him justice, and that's a real travesty.
How much do you think of this he brought upon himself? We mentioned what Horner said earlier. He's made some poor choices in terms of the teams he went to and burnt some important bridges as well along the way in his career.
Clearly, that's part of the problem. I think he will look back, ending up in the wrong place at the right time, the right place at the wrong time, and various combinations of that. There have been mistakes, and I think if he had his time again, he'd probably make some better decisions.
Now, obviously, that creates a couple of vacancies potentially at McLaren to fill next year, because there seems to be some doubt over Van Dorn's position there. Who should replace him?
I think that the fact that they haven't, or that McLaren were sketchy over whether to keep Van Dorn, whether to promote Lando Norris. We know that Norris is a superb talent in waiting, but not quite maybe ready for F1 next year, shows that a Van Dorn-Norris lineup doesn't really appeal to McLaren. So they'll be looking outside of that. They'll look for someone who's an established operator, someone that brings a bit of commercial value. And I think the favourite at the moment is going to be Carlos Sainz Jr. I mean, McLaren will need Red Bull not to pick Sainz to replace Daniel Ricciardo. But our understanding is that Pierre Gasly is the favourite for that role anyway. That makes Sainz available. Red Bull have an option on Sainz until next month, September. Once that passes, he can sign a deal with anyone else. And my suspicion is that McLaren will make that their priority, that Sainz will be the driver that has commercial value because of the name. Obviously, his father's a legend. He's an established midfield operator. He's regularly scoring points. We know that he does the business when the opportunity arises. So he's a safer pair of hands than Van Dorn, and arguably slightly better at this moment in time as a Grand Prix driver.
Some fascinating insight there, guys. Thanks very much for viewing. Please leave your comments below. We can take them good or bad. Don't forget to get all the latest news on autosport.com. Autosport magazine is out every Thursday with even more analysis of the breaking news in the sport. Thank you.